3 steps away from saying, "I do," when the pastor's hand shot up and stopped everything. The church went silent. 200 guests froze. The groom's face was drained of color, and the bride, standing there in her white dress with flowers trembling in her hands, looked like she'd seen a ghost. What could make a man of God halt a sacred ceremony in front of everyone? What did he see in her eyes that no one else noticed? Stay with me, because what unfolded that day in a small Virginia chapel will make you question everything you think you know about the people standing right in front of you. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. It started 3 months earlier. Pastor Michael Hayes had known Sarah Thompson since she was 7 years old. He'd watched her grow up in his congregation, seen her volunteer at church events, heard her sing in the choir. She was the kind of young woman every parent hoped their daughter would become. Thoughtful, kind, always the first to help when someone needed it. So when she came to his office that spring afternoon and told him she was getting married, he was genuinely happy for her. The groom's name was Daniel Foster. He worked in finance, came from a good family 2 towns over, and seemed polite and respectful during their pre-marriage counseling sessions. Pastor Hayes had married dozens of couples in his 20 years of ministry. He knew how to read people, knew the questions to ask, knew the warning signs of relationships that might not last. With Sarah and Daniel, he saw none of those red flags. They seemed steady, compatible, ready. But there was something else he noticed, something small that most people would have missed entirely. During their 3rd counseling session, when he asked Sarah about her family, she paused just a second too long before answering. Her smile stayed in place, but her eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite name. Sadness, maybe. Or fear. He made a mental note, but didn't press her. Sometimes people needed time to open up about difficult things. The day before the wedding, Sarah's mother called him. Her name was Patricia, and she'd been a member of his church for nearly 30 years. She sounded strained on the phone, her voice tight with something he couldn't identify. When she arrived 20 minutes later, she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Dark circles under her eyes, hands twisting a tissue into shreds. Patricia started talking slowly, carefully, like she was walking through a minefield of words. She told him that Sarah hadn't always been their daughter. They'd adopted her when she was 6 years old from a situation she described only as very bad. Sarah had been removed from her biological mother's home by child services after neighbors reported hearing screaming and seeing bruises. The details of what that little girl had endured were sealed in court records, but Patricia said it was enough to give anyone nightmares. She and her husband had fostered Sarah first, then adopted her a year later when the biological mother's parental rights were terminated. Sarah had been a sweet child, quiet and eager to please, but she'd struggled with fear. Fear of loud noises, fear of being left alone, fear of making mistakes. They'd gotten her therapy, given her all the love and stability they could, and over the years, Sarah had blossomed into the remarkable young woman everyone knew. But Patricia wasn't there to tell him the happy parts. She was there because 2 days ago, Sarah had received a letter. The biological mother, whose name was Catherine, had found her somehow. She'd been released from prison 4 months earlier after serving time for drug-related charges, and she wanted to see her daughter again. The letter said she was clean now, that she'd found God in prison, that she was a different person. She wanted forgiveness. She wanted a relationship, and she was coming to the wedding. Sarah had called the number on the letter, and Catherine had cried on the phone, begging to be let back into her daughter's life. Sarah, with that kind heart that couldn't turn anyone away, had said yes. She'd sent her an invitation. Patricia's hands were shaking as she told Pastor Hayes this. She said she was terrified that Catherine would show up and say something, do something, cause a scene that would ruin Sarah's special day. But worse than that, she was terrified that Sarah was making this decision not out of genuine forgiveness, but out of fear. The same fear that had ruled her childhood. The fear of disappointing people, of being abandoned again, of not being good enough. Pastor Hayes listened to all of this in silence, his heart breaking for this family he'd known so long. He asked Patricia if Sarah had talked to Daniel about any of this. Patricia shook her head. Sarah hadn't told him about the letter, hadn't told him her birth mother was coming. She was afraid he'd be angry, afraid he'd think less of her if he knew the truth about where she came from. The morning of June 15th dawned clear and beautiful. By 9:30, the church was filled with guests. Pastor Hayes stood in his office, putting on his vestments, watching through the window as cars pulled into the parking lot. He saw Daniel arrive with his groomsmen, all of them laughing and joking, full of that nervous energy grooms always had. He saw Sarah's mother arrive, her face drawn and anxious, scanning every car that pulled in. And then, at 9:45, he saw a woman he didn't recognize step out of an old sedan. She was thin, too thin, with badly dyed blonde hair and clothes that looked like they'd been bought at a thrift store. She stood in the parking lot for a long moment, staring up at the church, and even from his window 3 stories up, Pastor Hayes could see she was crying. That was Catherine, Sarah's biological mother. The sanctuary was packed. 200 people filled the pews. The music started, that traditional processional everyone recognizes. The bridesmaids walked down the aisle, smiling at the guests. Daniel stood at the altar, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes locked on the back doors, waiting for his bride. And then Sarah appeared. She looked beautiful. Her dress was simple, elegant, with lace sleeves and a flowing train. Her dark hair was pulled back, with small white flowers woven through it. She carried a bouquet of roses and baby's breath. But Pastor Hayes wasn't looking at the dress or the flowers. He was looking at her face, and what he saw there made his heart sink. She looked terrified, not the normal pre-wedding jitters, kind of nervous. Actually terrified. Her eyes were wide, darting around the room, like she was looking for an escape route. Her hands were shaking so badly the flowers trembled, and when her gaze landed on someone sitting in the back row, her face went completely pale. Pastor Hayes followed her line of sight. There, in the last pew on the left side, sat Catherine. She was crying quietly, clutching a tissue, staring at her daughter with a mixture of hope and desperation that was painful to witness. Sarah's steps faltered. For a moment, Pastor Hayes thought she might actually turn and run. But her father, who was walking her down the aisle, squeezed her arm gently and whispered something in her ear. She took a breath and kept walking. 1 step, another step, 3 steps away from the altar, 3 steps away from Daniel, who was smiling at her with so much love and happiness it was almost cruel. 3 steps away from making promises she wasn't ready to make, to a man who didn't even know the full truth of who he was marrying. And that's when Pastor Hayes made a decision that would change everything. He held up his hand. The music stopped. The sanctuary went silent. "I'm sorry, but I cannot proceed with this ceremony." The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop. Then the whisper started, a low murmur of shock and confusion rippling through the crowd. Daniel stepped forward, his face flushing red. He demanded to know what was going on, what kind of joke this was. Sarah's father looked like he might actually punch someone. The bridesmaids exchanged horrified glances, and Sarah just stood there frozen, her bouquet slipping from her hands and hitting the floor with a soft thud. Pastor Hayes looked directly at her when he spoke next. He said that marriage was a sacred covenant that required honesty, vulnerability, and trust. He said that he'd been a pastor long enough to know when 2 people were ready to make that commitment, and when they weren't. He said that sometimes love wasn't enough. Sometimes people needed to heal first, needed to face their past first, needed to learn how to be honest with themselves and others first. And he said that he could not in good conscience stand before God and witness vows that were being made from a place of fear instead of freedom. Daniel was furious now, demanding to know who the pastor thought he was to make that judgment. Sarah's father was trying to calm him down, while also looking betrayed and confused. The guests were talking openly now, some standing up, some pulling out their phones. It was chaos. But through it all, Pastor Hayes kept his eyes on Sarah, and slowly, so slowly, tears started rolling down her face. Not the delicate tears of a moved bride, the ugly, gasping sobs of someone whose carefully constructed walls had just been demolished. Her mother rushed forward from her seat and wrapped her arms around her daughter. Sarah collapsed against her, crying so hard her whole body shook. And then, From the back of the church, Catherine stood up. Every head turned to look at this stranger, who nobody knew. She walked forward slowly, and you could see everyone trying to figure out who she was, what role she played in this disaster. When she reached the front, she looked at Sarah with such raw pain and regret that even the angriest guests fell silent. Catherine spoke quietly, but in that acoustically perfect sanctuary, everyone heard every word. She said she was sorry. She said she knew she had no right to be there, no right to ask for anything after what she'd done. She said she'd spent 6 years in prison thinking about the little girl she'd hurt, the daughter she'd failed in every possible way. She said she'd written that letter hoping for something she didn't deserve, and when Sarah had invited her, she'd been so grateful she'd cried for hours. But standing here now, watching her beautiful daughter in a wedding dress, she realized she'd been selfish again. She'd put her own needs, her own desire for redemption, above what was best for Sarah, just like she'd always done. She said that Sarah deserved a fresh start without the ghosts of the past haunting her. She said she'd leave and never contact her again if that's what Sarah needed. And then she said the words that broke everyone's heart. She said, "I love you. I know I don't have the right to say that after everything, but I need you to know that I love you, and I'm so sorry for all the pain I caused. You deserve better. You deserve better now." Sarah pulled away from her mother and looked at Catherine for a long moment. Then she looked at Daniel, who was standing there looking completely lost, like someone had pulled the rug out from under his entire world. And then she looked at Pastor Hayes. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse from crying, but steady. She said, "You're right. I'm not ready." Those 4 words fell like stones into water, creating ripples that spread through the entire congregation. She turned to Daniel and told him she was sorry. She said she loved him, but she'd been lying to him about so many things, not because she didn't trust him, but because she didn't trust herself. She'd been pretending to be someone she wasn't, someone who had it all together, someone who'd moved past her childhood and didn't carry scars anymore. But the truth was she did carry scars, deep ones, and she'd been so afraid he'd see them and leave that she'd hidden them instead. Daniel stood there for a long moment, processing everything. Then he did something that surprised everyone. He stepped forward and hugged her, just held her while she cried into his shoulder, in front of 200 witnesses and a mother she barely knew and a pastor who'd just blown up their wedding. He whispered something in her ear that nobody else heard. When he pulled back, there were tears on his face too. He nodded once, kissed her forehead, and walked back down the aisle. 6 months after the wedding that never happened, Sarah came back to the church for Sunday service. It was the first time Pastor Hayes had seen her since that June morning. She looked different, lighter somehow. She'd cut her hair short and wore less makeup, like she'd stopped trying so hard to look like everyone's idea of the perfect church girl. After the service, she asked if she could talk to him. Sarah thanked him for stopping the wedding. She said it had been the worst and best day of her life. Worst because everything she'd been hiding had been exposed in the most public way possible. Best because it had finally freed her from the exhausting work of pretending to be okay when she wasn't. She said she'd been so angry at him at first, so humiliated and hurt. But as she'd worked through everything in therapy, she'd come to realize he'd given her an incredible gift. He'd seen her, really seen her, when she'd spent years making sure nobody could. And he'd loved her enough to risk his reputation and relationships to stop her from making a mistake that would have haunted both her and Daniel for years. She told him about her progress, about learning to set boundaries with Catherine, about the honest conversations she was having with Daniel about their future. She said she didn't know if they'd get married someday or not, but if they did, it would be because she was ready, not because she was running from something. That's the story of the pastor who stopped a wedding. No scandal, no dramatic revelation of cheating or lies. Just a man who knew a young woman well enough to see that she was about to make vows from a place of woundedness instead of wholeness, and he cared enough to intervene even when it meant facing criticism and judgment. So let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew something was wrong, but went ahead with it anyway because backing out would be too embarrassing, too complicated, too hard? Have you ever made a major life decision while running from something instead of running toward something? Think about the people in your life. The ones planning weddings or big moves or major life changes. If you knew, really knew deep in your gut, that they weren't ready, that they were making these choices for the wrong reasons, would you have the courage to say something? That's the question Pastor Hayes faced. He chose love over comfort. He chose truth over approval. And yes, it cost him something. But it gave Sarah something infinitely more valuable. It gave her permission to stop performing, to stop pretending, to stop running. It gave her the chance to actually heal instead of just covering up the wounds with white lace and promises. So what would you have done if you were in Pastor Hayes' position? Would you have stopped the ceremony or performed it and hoped for the best? And if you were Sarah, would you have been grateful or furious? Let me know in the comments. And if this story made you feel something, subscribe and share it with someone who might need to watch it. Thanks for watching.